The wind was a blade against Clara Rollins' face, sharp and cold enough to steal the breath from her lungs. It whipped her black morning dress against her legs as she pushed the last shovelful of frozen earth onto the mound. The ground was stubborn, fighting the shovel with every push, just as it had fought to take her husband. Now it had him. James was gone, buried beneath a thin blanket of dirt that would soon be covered in snow. She stood alone at the crude grave, a solitary figure against the vast, unforgiving Wyoming sky. The few townspeople from Sage Hollow who had bothered to watch the burial had already retreated to the warmth of their homes. Their duty done, they had stood at a distance, their faces pinched with a mixture of pity and judgment. Clara could feel their unspoken words hanging in the frigid air. James Rollins had been a fool. He had pushed too hard, spoken too loud, and fought for a piece of land that a bigger man wanted. He had brought this trouble on himself, and by extension, on his wife. Clara felt nothing but a hollow ache where her heart used to be. The grief was a physical weight, pressing down on her shoulders, making it hard to stand. She and James had come west with dreams of a life built with their own hands, a life of freedom and promise. They had poured every cent and every drop of sweat into their small homestead, a patch of dirt that was now marked by a shallow grave. He had died defending it in a spray of gunfire that still echoed in her nightmares. Now she was a widow at 24, with no money, no family, and no one to turn to. Returning to the small, two-room cabin felt like walking into another grave. The silence was deafening. Every object held a memory of James, his worn hat hanging on a peg by the door, his half-finished cup of coffee still on the table, the scent of his tobacco lingering faintly in the air. The cold had seeped through the chinks in the logs, and the fire in the hearth had long since died. She was too tired, too empty, to even think of rekindling it. She sank onto their bed, the corn husk mattress rustling beneath her, and pulled a threadbare quilt over her body, not for warmth, but to hide from the emptiness that surrounded her. The next day brought the banker, a portly man named Mr. Henderson, whose sympathy was as thin as the winter sun. He cleared his throat, avoiding her gaze as he explained the legalities. The loan for the land was in James's name. With him gone, and no means to make the upcoming payment, the bank had no choice but to reclaim the property. He gave her 1 week. 1 week to dismantle a life, 1 week to pack up the remnants of a shattered dream. Desperation became Clara's constant companion. She tried to sell their meager possessions, hoping to gather enough coin for a stagecoach ticket, though she had no idea where she would even go. She laid out James's tools, the sturdy German steel axe he had been so proud of, the plow they had nearly starved to purchase. She offered the spare furniture, the rocking chair James had made for her, the small pine table where they had shared their meals. The neighbors came, but not to buy. They came to stare. Goodwife Albright pursed her lips and shook her head, muttering to her husband about the bad luck that clung to the Rollins homestead. Another farmer picked up the axe, weighed it in his hand, then set it down again. His eyes filled with a wary superstition. "A tool used by a dead man brings a curse," he said, more to himself than to her. The whispers followed her like a shadow. Cursed. That was the word they used. She was the widow of a troublemaker, a woman touched by violence and death. No one wanted any part of it. With the homestead picked bare by creditors and her own failed attempts to sell what was left, she walked the 3 miles into Sage Hollow. The town was little more than a single dusty street lined with wooden storefronts, a saloon, a church, and a general store. It was a place that prided itself on hard work and respectable folk, and Clara, a lone woman with no family to speak for her, was now neither. She tried the hotel first, asking if they needed a laundress or a cook. The owner, a man with a greasy apron and a wandering eye, looked her over and said he had all the help he needed. At the Mercantile. "Mr." Gable shook his head regretfully. "Times are hard. Mrs. Rollins, I can't afford to hire anyone. He didn't add the unspoken part, that hiring a woman like her would be bad for business. Respectable wives wouldn't want to shop in a store where a cursed widow worked. Day after day, she faced the same rejection. The doors of the small community were closed to her, locked tight by suspicion and fear. She was an outsider, a problem no one wanted to solve. Her savings dwindled to a few pennies, just enough for a small bag of flour and some beans. Hunger became a dull, constant ache in her belly. It was on her last day. As the sun began to set, casting long, cold shadows across the street, that Silas Croft approached her. He was the wealthiest man in the county, a rancher with a sprawling empire and a reputation for getting whatever he wanted. He was an older man, his face a roadmap of wrinkles and his belly straining against the buttons of his fine wool coat. He tipped his hat, a gesture that felt more like a claim than a courtesy. Mrs. Rollins," he said, his voice smooth and low. "I heard about your troubles. A tragedy. A real tragedy." Clara clutched her worn shawl tighter around her shoulders. "Thank you for your concern. Mr. Croft." "A woman like you shouldn't be left to fend for herself," he continued, his eyes lingering on her face, her slender frame. "It's not right. This is a hard country for a woman alone." She knew what was coming. She had seen the way men like him looked at women like her, women with no one to protect them. They saw weakness, an opportunity. "I can offer you a solution," he said, stepping closer. The smell of whiskey and cigars clung to him. "I have a large house, plenty of work for a woman's hands. You would have a roof over your head, food in your belly, protection." The word hung in the air between them, heavy and ugly. Protection. He wasn't offering a job. He was offering a gilded cage. She would be his property, expected to warm his bed and submit to his whims in exchange for survival. The thought made her stomach churn with a sickness far worse than hunger. She looked him straight in the eye, her own gaze clear and cold as ice. "I am not for sale. Mr. Croft." His smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of irritation. "You mistake my generosity for something else. Girl, it's a kind offer, the only one you're like to get. Think on it. When you're starving in a ditch, my offer might look a lot better." He turned and walked away, leaving her shivering in the growing twilight, the weight of his threat settling upon her. That night, she made her decision. If the world of men and towns had cast her out, she would seek her chances elsewhere. The mountains loomed to the west, a jagged line of purple and gray against the horizon. They were wild, dangerous, home to wolves and winter storms, but they were also a place of solitude, a place where the whispers of Sage Hollow could not reach her. She packed what little she had left, a thick wool blanket, the small bag of dried beans, a tin cup, and a water skin. Lastly, she took James's revolver from the wooden box beneath their bed. The Colt Peacemaker was heavy in her hand, cold and deadly. James had taught her how to shoot, to load the cylinder and sight down the barrel. "Just in case," he had said. She had never fired it at anything but an empty can. Now, it felt like the only friend she had left in the world. She saddled her horse, Daisy, a gentle mare with a coat the color of honey. The horse was all she had of value, and she knew she should have sold her, but she couldn't bear the thought. Daisy was a link to the life she had lost, a living, breathing creature in a world that had become cold and silent. Clara did not look back at the cabin or the grave as she rode away. She fixed her eyes on the rising slopes of the mountains, her jaw set with a grim determination. She would survive. She had to. It was the only way to honor the man who had died for this land. The first day of travel was bearable. The air was crisp, and the sun offered a weak, watery warmth. But as she climbed higher, the landscape grew more rugged, the trees thicker, the trail harder to follow. The wind began to bite, carrying the scent of snow. By the second afternoon, the sky had turned a leaden gray. The first flakes began to fall, soft and delicate at first, then harder, thicker. driven by a rising wind. A sense of dread began to creep into Clara's heart. She was a prairie girl. She knew the danger of a sudden blizzard. She urged Daisy onward, searching desperately for some kind of shelter, a cave, an overhanging rock, anything to shield them from the storm's fury. The world dissolved into a swirling vortex of white. The snow came down in a blinding sheet, erasing the trail, the trees, the very shape of the land. The wind howled like a hungry animal, tearing at her clothes and stinging her exposed skin. Daisy whinnied in fear, stumbling on the uneven, snow-covered ground. Clara could no longer feel her fingers or her toes. The cold was a deep, seeping thing, leaching the strength from her bones. She dismounted, hoping to lead the horse, but every step was a struggle against the wind and the deepening drifts. Her body screamed with exhaustion. She fell once, then twice, the snow a deceptively soft blanket that invited her to simply lie down and rest. The thought was tempting, a siren's call to sleep, to let the cold take her and end the pain. But the image of James's face, smiling and full of hope, flashed in her mind. She could not give up. She pushed herself to her feet one last time, taking a few more stumbling steps before her legs finally gave out. She collapsed into a snowdrift, the world spinning around her. The last thing she saw before the darkness took her was the vague, dark shape of something man-made through the blizzard. A structure, a cabin perhaps, or maybe it was just a trick of the dying light. A final, cruel mirage. Then there was only the cold and the silence. Warmth was the first thing she registered, a deep, penetrating warmth that seemed to be pulling her back from a great, cold distance. Then came the scent of wood smoke and roasting meat, a smell so rich and savory it made her empty stomach clench. She felt the heavy weight of a fur blanket over her, rough and smelling of pine and animal. Clara's eyelids fluttered open. The light was dim, flickering. She was lying on a pallet of straw and furs near a large stone fireplace where a low fire crackled and hissed. The room was small, the walls built of rough-hewn logs chinked with mud. A simple table and 2 chairs stood in the center. The walls were adorned not with pictures or decorations, but with tools of survival: hunting rifles mounted on wooden pegs, snowshoes, and a collection of steel traps hanging from a nail. Her gaze traveled from the rifles to the figure sitting in one of the chairs by the fire. A man. He was staring into the flames, his back partially to her. He was broad-shouldered, dressed in buckskin and worn denim. His hair was dark and shaggy, touching the collar of his shirt. He seemed perfectly still, a part of the quiet, rustic cabin itself. A small cough escaped her lips, dry and raw. The man turned his head slowly. His face was all angles and shadows in the firelight. It was a hard face, weathered by sun and wind, with lines etched around his eyes and mouth that spoke of a difficult life. A dark, untrimmed beard covered his jaw, but it was his eyes that held her. They were a pale, startling blue, and they watched her with an unnerving intensity, guarded and unreadable. There was no welcome in them, no curiosity, only a flat, neutral assessment. He rose from his chair. He was tall, taller than James had been, and he moved with a quiet, deliberate grace that seemed at odds with his rugged appearance. He walked to the hearth, ladled some broth from a pot hanging over the fire into a wooden bowl, and brought it to her. He knelt beside her pallet, not too close, and held it out. "Drink," he said. His voice was a low rumble, rough like gravel. Clara pushed herself up on her elbows, her body aching and weak. She took the bowl with trembling hands, the warmth seeping into her frozen fingers. She drank the broth greedily. It was hot and salty, with the rich taste of venison. It was the most wonderful thing she had ever tasted. When she finished, he took the empty bowl from her without a word and returned to his chair by the fire. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the crackling of the logs. Clara's mind, slow and foggy, began to clear. She was in a stranger's cabin, a man who lived alone in the mountains, surrounded by guns. Every instinct screamed danger. "Where am I?" she asked, her voice raspy. "My cabin," he answered, not looking at her. Who are you?" He hesitated for a moment, as if the question were an intrusion. "Eli Carver." The name meant nothing to her. "You found me." "Found your horse first. You were half buried in the snow. Lucky I was checking my trap lines." He spoke in short, clipped sentences, offering no more information than was necessary. She pulled the fur blanket tighter around herself, her fear warring with a profound sense of gratitude. He had saved her life. But why? Men in this part of the country rarely did anything for nothing. She looked at his hands, resting on the arms of his chair. They were large and calloused, the knuckles scarred. They were the hands of a man who worked and fought. And deep within his guarded eyes, she saw something else, something buried and painful that he kept locked away. "The storm's not letting up," he said, his gaze still fixed on the fire. "Could last for days. You can stay until you're well enough to ride." It was not an invitation, but a simple statement of fact. He had rescued her from the storm, and he would give her shelter until it passed. After that, she would be on her own again. Clara lay back down, her head spinning. She was alive. She was warm, but she was not safe. She was trapped by the blizzard in a remote cabin with a hard, silent stranger, a man whose past was a complete mystery. She didn't trust him, not for a second, but as the wind howled outside, shaking the very walls of the cabin, she knew with a chilling certainty that she had nowhere else to go. The days that followed bled into one another, marked only by the shifting light through the cabin's single grime-streaked window. Outside, the world remained a maelstrom of white. The snow fell relentlessly, piling in great drifts against the door and walls, sealing them inside the small, smoky room. The isolation was absolute. For Clara, it was a slow return to life. The deep, bone-aching cold of the blizzard receded, replaced by the dull ache of muscles unused and the sharp pangs of a hunger that was finally being sated. Eli Carver remained a ghost in his own home. He was a creature of routine and silence. Each morning, before the sun had fully risen, he would be up, stoking the fire until it roared back to life. His movements economical and quiet. He would leave a plate of fried salt pork and a tin cup of bitter coffee on the hearth for her before pulling on his heavy winter coat and snowshoes and disappearing into the white wilderness. He would be gone for hours, sometimes the entire day, returning with a brace of rabbits or a grouse slung over his shoulder. He never spoke of where he went or what he saw. He was simply a presence that came and went, as predictable and as distant as the rising and setting of the unseen sun. He avoided her eyes. When she spoke, offering a quiet thank you for the food, he would give a short, sharp nod, his gaze fixed on the fire, the floor, the rifles on the wall, anywhere but her face. The emotional distance he kept was as vast and as cold as the snow-covered mountains outside. Yet, his actions contradicted his demeanor. He made sure she was warm, fed, and had water. He had cleaned and oiled her husband's revolver, which he'd found in her saddlebag, and placed it on the small crate beside her pallet. It was a gesture she couldn't decipher. Was it a kindness, ensuring she had her protection, or a warning, a reminder of the violent world they both inhabited? As her strength returned, Clara could no longer bear the helplessness of lying on the pallet. She began to move about the small cabin, her steps tentative at first. She swept the rough plank floor with a broom made of bound twigs. She washed their few dishes in a bucket of melted snow. She took the rabbits he brought back and stewed them with the last of her dried beans, the savory aroma filling the cramped space and, for a moment, making it feel less like a prison and more like a shelter. Eli accepted her contributions with the same stoic silence, But she noticed he ate the stew she prepared, every last bite. One evening, while Eli was outside splitting the last of the wood he'd hauled in before the storm, a gnawing curiosity finally overwhelmed her caution. His belongings were sparse, a testament to a life stripped down to its essentials, but on a small, crudely made shelf above his own bedroll in the far corner, there was a worn, leather-bound book. It was not a Bible. Its cover was scuffed and scarred, the leather dark with age and use. It felt like the only personal object in the entire cabin. Her hands trembled slightly as she took it down. It was a journal. The pages were filled with a jagged, forceful script. The ink faded in some places, dark and angry in others. It was not a diary of daily events, but a chaotic collection of thoughts. Some pages were filled with half-scribbled phrases. The price of a man's soul. West of the Pecos. God stops listening. Redemption is just a word for forgetting. Interspersed with the words were drawings, sketched with a startling skill. She saw the grim, gaunt faces of men, maps of canyons and riverbeds, and, more disturbingly, sketches that looked like battlefields. She saw the layout of a dusty street, with X's marking positions in doorways and on rooftops. It was the cold geometry of a gunfight. Then she found the list. It was a list of names, perhaps a dozen of them. Henry Sloan, Marcus Thorne, the Miller brothers. Each name was written in that same aggressive hand, and beside each one was a date. And through every single name, a thick, dark line had been drawn, crossing them out with a finality that sent a shiver down her spine. These were not debts paid. This was a ledger of death. Her suspicion hardened into a near certainty. Eli Carver was no simple trapper or mountain man. He was, or had been, a gunslinger, a man who lived by the revolver and whose past was littered with crossed-out names. She closed the journal, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs, and quickly put it back on the shelf just as she heard the crunch of his boots in the snow outside the door. She scurried back to the hearth, her mind reeling. The man who had saved her life was a killer. The knowledge was terrifying. Yet it explained so much: the guarded eyes, the haunted silence, the rifles on the wall. He was a man hiding from a life she could barely imagine. A new kind of tension began to grow in the cabin, thicker and more potent than the silence that had preceded it. It was an awareness of each other that was both awkward and intensely charged. Clara found herself watching him, studying the way he cleaned his rifle with methodical precision, the fluid strength in his shoulders as he chopped wood, the deep lines on his face when he thought she was not looking, and sometimes, when she was stirring the stew or mending a tear in her dress by the firelight, she would feel the weight of his gaze on her. When she looked up, he would immediately turn away, his expression unreadable, but she had seen it. He was watching her, too. One afternoon, the steady, rhythmic thud of his axe splitting firewood outside suddenly stopped. It was followed by a sharp, guttural curse. Clara rushed to the door and peered out. Eli was standing with his back to her, his shoulders rigid. He was staring at his left hand. A dark line of red was welling up, dripping onto the pristine white snow. The axe, slick with blood, lay at his feet. He must have missed his mark, the blade glancing off the log and into his own hand. Without thinking, she grabbed a strip of clean linen she had been saving and hurried out into the biting cold. "Let me see," she said, her voice firm. He turned, a dark scowl on his face. "It's nothing." "It is not nothing. You are bleeding all over the snow," she insisted, reaching for his hand. He flinched, pulling back as if her touch might burn him. But she was persistent, gently but firmly taking his large, calloused hand in her own. The cut was deep, a nasty gash across his palm. The sight of his blood made her feel a strange, protective surge. "Come inside," she ordered, her tone leaving no room for argument. He followed her, a reluctant giant, and sat heavily in the chair by the fire while she fetched the bucket of clean water. She knelt before him and began to clean the wound. His hand was rough and scarred, a map of a hard-lived life. Yet, as she worked, she could feel the tension in him, the tight control he held over himself. Her fingers, small and gentle against his, worked methodically, washing away the blood. Their closeness was a palpable thing. She could feel the heat radiating from his body, smell the scent of pine and cold air that clung to him. She was keenly aware of his breathing, of the way his chest rose and fell. She wrapped the linen tightly around his palm, her head bowed to her task. When she finished, she tied the knot and her fingers lingered for a second too long on his wrist. She looked up, and for the first time, he did not look away. His pale blue eyes met hers, and in their depths, she saw a flicker of something she had not seen before, not anger, not indifference, but a raw, aching vulnerability. It was as if the wound in his hand had opened a crack in the armor around his soul. The moment stretched, fragile and unspoken, filled with a meaning neither of them was ready to confront. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the mask slammed back into place. He pulled his hand away, stood up, and walked to the far side of the cabin, turning his back to her. The invisible wall between them was once again firmly in place, but now they were both aware of the door that had been briefly opened. The argument, when it finally came, erupted out of the strained silence. It was a few days later, the air in the cabin thick with unspoken thoughts. Clara could no longer stand the pretense, the feeling of living with a ghost who carried a ledger of dead men in his journal. "Why are you hiding up here?" she asked abruptly, her voice sharp. Eli was sharpening a skinning knife by the fire, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone the only sound. He did not stop. "Not hiding, living." "There is a difference," she shot back, her frustration boiling over. "You barely speak. You disappear for hours. You live like a man with no name." She took a breath. "I saw your journal, Eli." The scraping stopped. He set the knife and stone down on the hearth with slow, deliberate care. He still did not look at her. "You had no right. And you had no right to leave me wondering if the man who saved my life might also be the man who ends it." The words were out before she could stop them, harsher than she intended. He finally turned to face her, his eyes blazing with a cold fire. "If I wanted you dead, woman, you would have been dead in the snow. Do you think I would have hauled you back here, fed you, kept you warm, if I meant you any harm? Then what do you mean? Who are those men on your list? What did you do?" His face hardened into a mask of stone. "That is my business. It has nothing to do with you." He stood up, towering over her. "You know nothing about the world. You come from your safe little life, with your husband and your home, and you think you understand things. You do not." The mention of her husband, of the life that had been torn from her, was like a slap. "My safe little life? My husband was shot down in the dirt over a piece of land. I buried him myself. I was cast out by my town and left to starve. Do not you dare speak to me of what I know." Tears of anger and grief welled in her eyes. "Whatever you are running from, it cannot be worse than what I have already lost." His anger seemed to drain away, replaced by something else, something that looked almost like fear. The fire in his eyes softened, and he looked away, his jaw tight. "Yes," he said, his voice a low, rough whisper. "It can—" He turned his back on her again, ending the conversation. He had not been cruel. His anger had been a shield, a desperate attempt to push her away, to keep his past buried. She understood then that his solitude was not a preference, it was a penance. A fragile truce settled between them in the days after the argument. The air was clearer, the questions unasked but understood. Clara began to help him in more meaningful ways. The storm had damaged the cabin, shaking loose some of the chinking between the logs. Together, they mixed mud and dried grass, and she handed him clumps of the mixture as he stood on a crate, forcing it into the gaps. They worked in a comfortable, silent rhythm, their hands and bodies moving in a strange, unspoken partnership. The shared, simple task of repairing his shelter began to repair the breach between them. In the quiet companionship of their work, Clara found a small, warming comfort. The isolation of the mountains no longer felt like a prison. It was becoming a sanctuary, a world that contained only the two of them. One evening, as darkness fell, a new sound pierced the steady moan of the wind. It was a long, mournful howl, rising and falling in the distance, closer than she had ever heard it before. A wolf. The sound was primal, lonely, and filled with a wild hunger that spoke of the unforgiving nature of the world outside their door. Another howl answered the first, this one seeming to come from just beyond the tree line. A tremor of pure, animal fear shot through Clara. She was a woman of the plains, where the dangers were vast but visible. The mountains held different fears, older and more hidden. She looked at Eli. He was sitting by the fire, cleaning his pistol, seemingly unperturbed. But she saw the way his hands had stilled, the way his head was cocked, listening. The wolf howled again, a chilling cry that sounded as if it were right outside the cabin wall. Despite the warmth from the fire, a cold dread washed over Clara. She thought of the flimsy wooden door, the darkness pressing in on them, the wildness of the world she had fled into. All the loss, the fear, the desperation of the past weeks coalesced into a single, overwhelming feeling of being utterly alone and vulnerable. She looked at her own cold, empty pallet on one side of the hearth. Then she looked at Eli, a formidable silhouette against the flickering flames. He was a man of violence and secrets, a man she should fear. But in that moment, he was also strength. He was a wall against the terrifying darkness. The silence in the cabin was his. The warmth from the fire was his. The very air she breathed was his. He was survival. Slowly, trembling, she stood up from her pallet. She crossed the small space between them and, without a word, she slipped into his bedroll beside him, pulling the thick fur up to her chin. Eli froze. Every muscle in his body went rigid. He did not look at her, did not move. He just sat there, his pistol still in his hand, staring into the fire as if he had been turned to stone. The tension in the air was so thick she could barely breathe. She expected him to push her away, to curse her, to demand what she was doing, but he said nothing. He simply sat there, a statue of conflicted stillness. The wolf howled again, its cry a raw and lonely sound that mirrored the ache in her own heart. The fear and the cold and the desperate need for another human soul to hold on to in the vast, terrifying darkness overwhelmed her pride. She pressed closer to the warmth of his body. Her voice was a ragged whisper, barely audible above the crackling fire and the howling wind. "Don't stop," she breathed, the words a plea torn from the deepest part of her. "I need this." He did not answer. He did not speak again for the rest of the night. But after a long, long moment, he slowly, carefully, set the pistol down on the hearth. He shifted his weight and lay down beside her, his back to her, still not touching. Then, as another howl ripped through the night, she felt his arm move, reaching back and pulling her against him. He held her, his large, warm body, a solid shield against the cold and the fear, and in the silent, desperate darkness of the mountain cabin, he held her until the dawn. That night changed the silence between them. It was no longer a void, an awkward space to be endured, but a shared territory. When Clara awoke the next morning, she was alone in the bedroll, but the indentation of Eli's body was still beside her, and the lingering warmth was a ghost of his presence. He was already outside, the steady ring of his axe against wood a familiar, grounding sound. Nothing was said of the night before, of her fear or his comfort. No words were needed. An invisible line had been crossed, a fragile pact made in the darkness. She was no longer just a stray he had taken in. She was a part of the cabin's small, isolated world. The snow continued to fall, a soft, ceaseless curtain that entombed them on the mountain. The drifts piled higher than the window, casting the cabin in a perpetual twilight, lit only by the flickering fire and a single tallow candle. They were cut off, adrift in a sea of white. Their lives shrank to the size of the single room, their existence dictated by the fundamental rhythms of survival. They fell into a routine that was as natural and unspoken as breathing. He would chop the wood, his powerful form a dark shape against the endless snow, the axe rising and falling with a strength that seemed to defy the cold. She would haul in the buckets of snow to melt for water, her arms aching, but her spirit resolute. He would hunt and trap, returning with frozen, fur-covered offerings that she would then transform into their sustenance. She would skin the rabbits and dress the birds, her hands, once soft, becoming chapped and capable. She learned to cook over the open fire, making thick, savory stews that filled their bellies and warmed them from the inside out. They moved around each other with a quiet, practiced grace. She knew the way he took his coffee, black and scalding. He knew that she would always save a piece of hardtack to gnaw on in the late afternoon. They shared the long silences, but now they were comfortable, punctuated by the small sounds of their life together, the scrape of a spoon against a bowl, the rustle of a fur blanket, the whisper of the flames in the hearth. In this shared quiet, she began to see the man beneath the hardened exterior. She saw the gentleness in the way he handled his hunting dog, a lean hound named Blue that lived in a small lean-to outside. She saw the focus in his eyes as he mended a tear in his leather gloves, his large, scarred hands surprisingly nimble. He was a man of immense control, of deep, buried feelings that only surfaced in fleeting glances or a tightening of his jaw. One day, when the sky cleared to a brilliant, painful blue and the sun glittered on the snow, Eli announced he was going to fish. Their supply of salted meat was running low. Clara, desperate for a reprieve from the cabin's dim interior, insisted on coming with him. He resisted at first, his usual gruffness returning. "It is no place for a woman. The ice is thick, the wind is sharp." "I am stronger than I look," she countered, her chin set stubbornly. "And I will go mad if I have to stare at these four walls for another day." He relented with a sigh, a small cloud of vapor in the frigid air. He bundled her in a spare fur-lined coat that was far too large for her, its scent of pine smoke and Eli wrapping around her like an embrace. He chopped a hole in the thick ice of a frozen creek with the axe, then showed her how to bait a small, crude hook with a piece of dried meat and lower the line into the dark, churning water below. They sat on a fallen log, their lines dangling in the icy water, not speaking. The cold was intense, seeping through their boots and coats, but the sun was bright, the air clean and sharp, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Clara felt a stirring of something other than grief or fear. After a long stretch of silence, she felt a tug on her line. With a surprised yelp, she yanked it up. A small, silver fish flopped onto the snow, glistening in the sun. A sound escaped her, one she had not made since before James's death. A laugh. It was a genuine, unrestrained peal of delight that echoed in the vast, snowy silence. She looked at Eli, her face flushed with cold and triumph. He was staring at her, and a strange, unreadable expression was on his face. And then she saw it. The corner of his mouth twitched, the barest hint of a smile, a crack in the stoic mask. It was gone as quickly as it came, but she had seen it. The sight of his fleeting smile made her laugh again, and soon she was trying to stifle giggles as she struggled to get the wriggling fish off the hook. He reached over, his large hand covering hers, and expertly freed the catch. His touch, even through their thick gloves, sent a jolt of warmth through her. "What was your life like before this?" she asked, her voice softer now, the laughter having broken the tension. "Before the mountains." He grew still, his gaze turning distant, fixed on the far-off peaks. The ghost of a smile vanished. "I was a different man." "What happened to him?" He was silent for a long time, watching the dark water swirl in the hole he had cut. "I tried to forget him," he said finally, his voice low and rough. "Some men are not meant to be remembered." That night, huddled by the fire, the fish stewing in the pot, his words echoed in her mind. Some men are not meant to be remembered. She thought of James, of the desperate need she had to keep his memory alive, to honor the man he was. She looked at Eli, who sat staring into the flames, lost in a past he was trying to erase. His vulnerability earlier that day had opened a door, and she felt a sudden, powerful urge to walk through it, to offer him a piece of her own broken past in return. "It was not just a land dispute," she said into the quiet. He turned his head slowly, his pale eyes finding hers in the dim light. "My husband's death," she clarified, her voice barely a whisper. "James, he was a good man, a decent man. He believed in what was right." She paused, gathering her courage, the memories sharp and painful. "The land we settled, it had a good stream. Silas Croft, the big rancher, he wanted it. He tried to buy us out, but James refused. This was our dream." She stared into the fire, seeing the events play out again in the dancing flames. James found out Croft was rerouting the water from the smaller homesteads, strangling them, forcing them to sell for pennies. He was going to ride to the territorial capital, to speak to the marshal, to expose him. He told Croft as much. He thought the threat of the law would be enough. Her voice cracked, and a single tear traced a path down her cheek. The next day, Croft's men came. They said it was about the boundary line. It was an excuse. It was not a fair fight. Eli, there were 3 of them. They shot him down while he was standing in his own doorway. They murdered him. She wrapped her arms around herself, a cold dread seeping into her bones that had nothing to do with the winter outside. "The worst part," she whispered, the words tasting like ash, "is the guilt. I was inside. I heard the shots. By the time I got to him, he was gone, and all I can think is, why him? Why not me? He was the strong one, the brave one. I survived, and I feel like a coward for it." She finally looked at him, her eyes pleading for, she did not know what. Understanding, perhaps. Absolution. Eli's face was a mask of stone, but his eyes held a deep, profound sorrow. He did not offer empty words of comfort. He simply listened, his silence a vessel for her grief. He reached out, not to touch her, but to place another log on the fire. The deliberate, practical act a strange sort of comfort. He was tending to the warmth, keeping the darkness at bay. He let the silence sit for a long time before he spoke, his voice a low rumble that seemed to come from the very depths of his soul. "Guilt is a heavier burden than a coffin." He looked at his own hands, turning them over as if seeing them for the first time. "It is something you carry until it grinds you into dust." He took a deep breath, and the story he had held buried for so long began to emerge, dragged piece by painful piece into the light. "I was once a hired gun," he said, the words stark and ugly in the quiet cabin. "I worked for men like Croft, men who wanted land, or gold, or revenge. I was good at it, too good." He told her of a life lived in dusty saloons and on windswept plains, a life measured in the weight of a pistol and the speed of a draw. He spoke of it dispassionately, as if describing another man's life. But then his voice changed, roughening with a pain that was still raw. "We were in a town in Kansas, a dispute over a cattle trail. My employer wanted a man removed. It was supposed to be simple, but it went wrong. The whole street erupted in gunfire." He paused, his eyes closing, and Clara could see the scene playing out behind his eyelids. There was a crossfire, a stray bullet. His voice broke. There was a little girl. She was playing on the boardwalk. She had a little cornhusk doll. He opened his eyes, and they were filled with a haunted, unbearable agony. "She just fell. I never even saw where the shot came from. It did not matter. I was there. My gun was drawn. My fight caused it." He fell silent, the horror of the memory sucking the air from the room. I swore that day I would never draw my gun for money again. I never have, but that did not stop the killing. The men I worked for, they could not afford to have a man with my knowledge just walk away. They put a price on my head, blamed me for things I did not do, to ensure I would never talk. He looked around the small, rustic cabin, at the rifles on the wall. So I came here, to these mountains. I came here to disappear, to let Eli Carver die. The confession hung between them, a testament to two different kinds of loss, two different burdens of guilt. He, the killer, haunted by the death of an innocent. She, the survivor, haunted by the death of a good man. They were two sides of the same violent, unforgiving coin. The storm hit that night, as if the turmoil of their confessions had summoned it from the heavens. It was no longer a gentle, blanketing snow, but a furious, raging blizzard. The wind shrieked like a banshee, throwing itself against the cabin with a physical force that made the log walls groan in protest. A sound like a cannon shot echoed through the room as a massive gust of wind tore the heavy wooden door from its leather hinges and sent it flying into a snowdrift. Instantly, the full fury of the blizzard poured into the cabin. Snow and ice swirled in, extinguishing the candle and threatening the fire. The temperature plummeted. Eli reacted without a moment's hesitation, grabbing the heavy table and shoving it against the doorway, a flimsy barricade against the raging storm. Clara helped him, her body numb with cold and fear, piling their bedrolls and anything else they could find against it. They had just managed to block the opening when a terrible groaning, cracking sound came from above. With a deafening crash, the top of the stone chimney collapsed, sending a shower of rock, soot, and snow down into the hearth, smothering the flames and choking the room with smoke. Their fire, their only source of heat, was gone, plunged into darkness and a terrifying, biting cold. They scrambled to survive. Eli, working by instinct in the pitch black, found the candle and managed to relight it. Its tiny flame cast frantic, dancing shadows on a scene of devastation. The cold was a physical entity, a predator that had invaded their sanctuary. "The fire is out," Clara stated, her teeth chattering uncontrollably. "We will freeze." "No," Eli said, his voice grim and determined. He looked around the cabin, his eyes falling on the two simple chairs. He grabbed one, and with a single, powerful motion, he smashed it against the floor, breaking it into pieces. He then turned to the crate that served as Clara's bedside table. He hesitated for only a second before splintering that as well. He built a small, new fire in the center of the floor, on the flat stones of the hearth that were not blocked by the chimney collapse. It was a small, desperate flame, but it was life. They burned the chairs first, then the shelf from the wall. They huddled beside the small, pathetic fire, wrapped in every blanket and fur they possessed. The wind howled through the chinks in the walls and the makeshift barricade at the door. The cold was relentless. It was only a matter of time before their fuel, and their warmth, ran out. Huddled in the near darkness, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of their burning furniture, Clara looked at the man beside her. His face was streaked with soot, his expression grim, but his eyes were clear and focused. He was a killer, a man running from a blood-soaked past, but he was also the man who had pulled her from the snow, who had fed her and sheltered her, who had held her through the night, and who was now fighting with every ounce of his being to keep her alive. She reached out and placed her hand on his arm. He flinched at her touch but did not pull away. "I am not afraid of your past, Eli," she whispered, her voice trembling with cold and a wave of emotion so powerful it threatened to consume her. "I am not afraid of you." He looked at her, his pale eyes searching hers in the firelight. He saw no judgment, no fear, only a deep, unwavering acceptance. The cold was seeping deeper into their bones. The fire was dying again. Their time was running out. She knew, with a certainty that transcended thought, what she wanted. She wanted to feel alive. One last time. She wanted to feel the warmth of another human being, a warmth that had nothing to do with fire and everything to do with connection. "Hold me," she whispered, the plea a raw, desperate need. "Please, hold me." He looked at her for a long moment, the firelight reflecting in his haunted eyes. Then, he nodded slowly. He fed the last of the splintered wood into the flames and then turned to her. He gathered her into his arms, pulling their shared blankets around them. His embrace was hesitant at first. Then it tightened with a desperation that matched her own. In the heart of the storm, beside a dying fire, surrounded by the remnants of their shattered shelter, they came together. It was not a gentle or romantic coupling. It was slow, aching, and raw. It was a collision of two wounded, lonely souls reaching for something warm in a world that had grown impossibly cold. Their movements were guided by a desperate, unspoken need to feel, to connect, to affirm that they were still alive. His touch was not that of a practiced lover, but of a man relearning a forgotten language. Her response was not that of a coy maiden, but of a woman claiming her own survival. Illuminated by the guttering candle and the embers of their last fire, they made love. It was not perfect. It was real. It was two broken hearts finding a fragile, fleeting solace in the arms of another. A desperate, defiant act of life in the very face of death. Spring did not arrive with a grand announcement. It came in whispers. It began with the sound of dripping water, a steady, rhythmic plink-plonk from the icicles melting on the eaves of the cabin. Then came the smell of damp earth, a rich, loamy scent that pushed through the sterile cold of winter. The creek, once silent and frozen, began to murmur and then to roar, its voice growing stronger each day as it threw off its shackles of ice. Birds returned, their songs a startling intrusion into the profound quiet Clara and Eli had shared for months. The thaw changed the world inside the cabin as much as it did the world outside. The perpetual twilight gave way to bright, clear sunlight that streamed through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air and the new lines of comfort etched around Clara's eyes. They ventured further from their shelter, their world expanding with the receding snow. Together, they gathered the first tender green shoots of wild onions and fiddlehead ferns. He taught her which roots were good to eat and which mushrooms would kill a person before they finished their meal. They worked to repair the ravages of the winter. The roof needed new patches of sod, and they worked side by side, passing the heavy squares of earth up the ladder Eli had fashioned. He moved with an easy strength, and she found herself watching the play of muscles in his back, the way his dark hair fell across his brow. There was a new ease between them, a physical language that had replaced their sparse words. A brush of his hand against hers as they reached for the same tool, the way he would steady her on the rickety ladder with a firm grip on her waist. These small moments were charged with the memory of that night in the storm, an intimacy that was now a permanent, unspoken part of the air they breathed. Their life was a fragile thing, a small bubble of peace in a harsh world, and they both knew it. But in the warmth of the spring sun, it was easy to pretend their bubble was impenetrable. The intrusion came on a Tuesday, a day like any other. Clara was scrubbing a pot by the creek when Eli's hunting dog, Blue, let out a low growl from the edge of the woods. A moment later, a man emerged from the trees, leading a tired-looking mule laden with traps and furs. He was wiry and old, his face a leathery mask of wrinkles, with a beard stained yellow by tobacco juice. He raised a hand in a gesture of peace. "Howdy, folks," he called out, his voice a gravelly croak. "Jebediah's the name. Been trapping this range for nigh on 30 years. Did not expect to see a homestead tucked back this far." Eli appeared at the cabin door, as silent as a shadow, his rifle held loosely in one hand. His body was relaxed, but his eyes were not. They were chips of ice, instantly assessing the old man. "You are a long way from the usual trails," Eli said, his voice flat. That I am. Jebediah chuckled, spitting a stream of tobacco juice onto a patch of lingering snow. The beaver are getting scarce down below. A man's got to push further these days. His eyes slid from Eli to Clara and back again, a flicker of curiosity in their watery depths. Mighty cozy setup you got here. A man could do worse. Clara, wiping her wet hands on her apron, felt a knot of unease tighten in her stomach. The trapper represented the outside world, the world they had hidden from, and his presence felt like a violation. Eli, however, showed no outward sign of alarm. He gestured curtly toward the fire pit. "Get down, have some coffee." It was not an invitation, but a command, a way to keep the man close, to size him up. For an hour, Jebediah talked, his voice filling the quiet clearing with news of the world they had left behind. He spoke of railroad disputes, of Indian troubles in the north, of the price of pelts in Cheyenne. Eli listened in stony silence, his gaze never leaving the old man's face. Clara busied herself with the coffee, keeping her head down, feeling like a stranger in her own small sanctuary. It was as Jebediah was getting ready to leave that it happened. He had taken a long drink of coffee, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand, when his eyes fixed on Eli's face, a slow, dawning recognition creeping into them. He squinted, his head cocked to one side. "Say now," he rasped, his friendly demeanor evaporating. "I know you. Took me a minute. Your picture is up in a dozen marshal's offices from here to the border, offering a handsome sum. $500. The clearing went utterly still. The only sounds were the rush of the creek and the frantic beating of Clara's heart. The old trapper's eyes narrowed further, a mixture of fear and greed clouding them. "They call you Black Carver." The name landed like a physical blow. It was dark, ugly, and filled with violence. It did not belong to the quiet, haunted man who had taught her how to fish through the ice, who had held her while she wept for her husband. Eli did not move. He did not blink. A profound and dangerous stillness settled over him, the stillness of a coiled snake. When he spoke, his voice was a low, chilling whisper, colder than any winter wind. "You did not see anyone here today, old man," he said. "You saw an empty cabin. You took a drink from the creek and you moved on. If I ever hear that you spoke a word of this to anyone, I will hunt you down. It does not matter where you go. I will find you, and I will cut your tongue out of your head." The threat was delivered without heat, without anger. It was a simple statement of fact, and that made it all the more terrifying. Jebediah's leathery face went pale. He scrambled to his feet, his eyes wide with terror, and practically threw himself onto his mule, kicking it into a clumsy trot without a backward glance. He disappeared into the trees, leaving a silence in his wake that was heavier and more oppressive than any they had known before. The peace was shattered. The bubble had burst. As soon as the trapper was gone, Clara turned to Eli, her body trembling. "Black Carver? A bounty? What does it mean?" Eli would not meet her eyes. He turned and walked back into the cabin, the dangerous stillness clinging to him like a shroud. She followed him, closing the door behind them, shutting out the spring sunlight. The cabin suddenly felt like a cage. "Tell me the truth, Eli," she demanded, her voice shaking. "All of it." He stood with his back to her, staring at the rifles mounted on the wall. For a long moment, she thought he would not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was hollow, stripped of all emotion. "The girl that was killed in Kansas," he began, his voice barely a whisper. "The one I told you about, the crossfire." He took a ragged breath. "It was my brother who fired the shot, my younger brother, Samuel. He was just a boy, barely 18, foolish and hot-headed. I brought him into that life. It was my fault." Clara felt the floor shift beneath her feet. "He would have hanged," Eli continued, his voice thick with a pain that was years old. "He had a wife, a baby on the way, a life ahead of him. I had nothing, just a name and a fast gun. He finally turned to face her, his eyes a maelstrom of guilt and despair. The men we were up against, they were powerful. When I told them I was quitting, they could not let it be. They pinned 2 other killings on me, killings their own men committed, to make sure I would always be running, that my word would mean nothing against theirs. So I let them. I took the blame. I told Samuel to take his wife and disappear, to change his name, start over. I made him promise he would never look back. The full, terrible truth settled upon Clara. Eli was not a killer haunted by an accident. He was a man who had sacrificed his own life, his own name, to save his brother. He had chosen to become a ghost, to wear the cloak of a murderer, so that his brother could live. The bounty, the name Black Carver. It was all a lie built on a single, selfless act. An overwhelming wave of love and a fierce, protective anger washed over her. He was not a monster. He was the most honorable man she had ever known. "We have to leave," she said, her voice urgent. She crossed the room and grabbed his arm, forcing him to look at her. "We can go now. We can ride west, to Oregon, or north to Canada. Somewhere they have never heard the name Black Carver. We can start a new life. Eli, together." He looked down at her hand on his arm, and then into her eyes. The hope that flared in her chest was immediately extinguished by the bleak emptiness she saw in his face. He slowly, gently, removed her hand. "There is no way, Clara," he said, his voice devoid of hope. "There is no new life for me. That name, that bounty, it is a shadow. It follows me wherever I go. I came to these mountains to be buried. I am a ghost, and ghosts do not get to start over." "That is not true," she cried, her desperation growing. "You are not a ghost. You are a man, a good man, who has done a noble thing. You do not have to live like this." "This is the only way I know how to live," he said, his voice hardening. "It is the only way I can keep you safe. As long as I am here, alone, no one will come looking. If I leave, if I try to be someone else, they will hunt me, and they will find me, and anyone with me will pay the price." He was not just refusing her offer. He was trying to protect her from himself. The argument that followed was bitter and raw, fueled by her desperate love and his stubborn self-loathing. She pleaded, she reasoned, she begged. She called him a coward for giving up, for letting those men win, for throwing his life away. He countered with a cold, hard realism, telling her she was a naive fool, that she knew nothing of the world he came from, a world where a man's life was worth less than the price of a bullet. "I have seen what that world does to good people," she sobbed, tears of frustration and heartbreak streaming down her face. "It took my husband. I will not let it take you, too." "It already has," he said, his voice flat and final. In a last, desperate attempt to break through the wall he had built around his heart, she stood before him, her small frame trembling, and spoke the 3 words she had been holding inside for weeks. "I love you, Eli." The words hung in the air between them, fragile and powerful. She searched his face for any sign, any flicker of response. She saw the turmoil in his eyes, the deep, aching sorrow. She saw the war he was fighting with himself, but he did not speak the words back. He could not. To admit he loved her would be to admit he had something to lose, a reason to fight for a life he truly believed was already over. He simply turned away from her, presenting her with his rigid, unyielding back. The silence that followed was more painful than any blow. It was the sound of her heart breaking. That night, Clara lay in her bedroll, staring into the darkness. His rejection, his refusal to even hope, had not extinguished her love. It had forged it into a hard, sharp resolve. If he would not save himself, then she would do it for him. He believed he was a ghost, a name on a wanted poster. She would prove to him that he was a man worthy of a life, a man worthy of being loved. A desperate plan formed in her mind. She would ride back to Sage Hollow, She would go to the sheriff. She would tell him everything she knew about Silas Croft, about how he had murdered her husband. Croft was a powerful man, but he was not above the law. If she could expose him, perhaps she could make a deal. Offer testimony against Croft in exchange for the law looking into Eli's case, for a chance to clear his name. It was a wild, foolish gamble, but it was the only one she had. Before the first hint of dawn, while Eli was still asleep, she rose as silently as a wraith. She dressed quickly, her movements sure and quiet. She packed a small satchel with some dried meat and a water skin. Lastly, she slipped James's revolver into the waistband of her skirt. She looked at Eli one last time, his dark hair falling across his face. The lines of pain softened in sleep. A fierce, aching love filled her. "I will not lose you," she thought. She slipped out of the cabin, the cool morning air a shock against her skin. She saddled Daisy with trembling hands, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. She did not look back as she urged the mare down the muddy, winding trail that led away from the mountains, away from the only place she had known safety, and back toward the world of men. The journey was treacherous. The spring thaw had turned the path into a morass of mud and slick rock. But Clara pushed onward, her mind focused on her goal. She rode for hours, the sun climbing higher in the sky. She was halfway to the plains, in a narrow, wooded ravine, when Daisy suddenly shied, her ears flattening against her head as she let out a nervous whinny. Clara reined her in, her hand immediately going to the butt of the revolver. She scanned the trees, her senses on high alert. The woods were too quiet. A twig snapped to her right. Before she could turn, 2 men stepped out onto the trail in front of her, blocking her path. A third emerged from the trees behind her. They were rough men, with cruel, pinched faces and guns holstered on their hips. She recognized them instantly. They were Silas Croft's men, the same men who had come to her homestead that fateful day, the men who had killed James. "Well, look what we have here," the leader sneered. A man with a scarred lip and dead, cold eyes. The little widow decided to come down from the mountain after all. "Mr. Croft was getting worried about you, said you might be a loose end that needed tying up." Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. They had been watching, waiting. They had not come for Eli. They had come for her. "Stay back," she warned, her voice coming out stronger than she felt. She pulled the revolver, its weight a small comfort in her hand, and leveled it at the man's chest. He just laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Put that away, little lady, before you hurt yourself." He took a step forward. Clara's hand tightened on the trigger. She would not die like James. She would not. She pulled the trigger. The explosion of the gunshot was deafening in the narrow ravine. The man grunted and staggered back, clutching his shoulder where a dark red stain was already blossoming on his shirt. But before she could fire again, the man behind her lunged. He grabbed her, his arm locking around her throat, and tore the gun from her grasp. She fought, kicking and scratching like a cornered animal, but he was too strong. The scarred man, his face contorted in a mask of rage, stalked toward her. "Stupid girl," he snarled, and then his fist came out of nowhere. A blinding flash of pain exploded behind her eyes. The world tilted, the green of the trees and the blue of the sky dissolving into a swirling blackness. And then there was nothing. Miles away, in the quiet of the mountain cabin, Eli Carver awoke with a start. He did not know what had woken him, only that something was wrong. The air in the cabin felt cold, empty. He looked toward Clara's pallet. It was empty. Her blanket was neatly folded. He was on his feet in an instant. Her satchel was gone. The peg where her coat hung was bare. A cold dread, worse than any blizzard, washed over him. He ran outside. The tracks were clear in the damp earth, leading away from the cabin, down the mountain. Daisy's tracks. And hers. He knew, with a gut-wrenching certainty, where she had gone, and why. The fool, the brave, stubborn, loving fool. She had gone to save him. He ran to the small corral where he kept his own horse. As he was saddling the powerful buckskin, his eyes scanned the trail below. He saw it then, a lone horse, a gentle mare the color of honey, wandering aimlessly among the trees, her reins dragging in the mud. Daisy, riderless. The world seemed to narrow to a single point. The quiet man who had sought to bury himself in the mountains died in that instant. The man who took his place was someone else entirely. Rage, pure and black and hotter than any forge, boiled up from the depths of his soul, mingling with a terror so profound it threatened to stop his heart. He checked the load in his rifle, his movements swift and economical. He slid his Colt from its holster, spinning the cylinder, his face a mask of cold, lethal fury. He was no longer a ghost hiding from his past. He was Black Carver, and he was going hunting. The trail of a panicked horse is not hard to follow. The trail of men trying to hide their tracks is... Eli Carver followed both. He moved through the woods with a speed and silence that was unnatural, his buckskin horse picking its way through the treacherous terrain without a sound. The rage that had ignited in him upon finding Daisy riderless had cooled into something far more dangerous, a cold, methodical certainty. Every snapped twig, every disturbed patch of mud, every scuff mark on a rock was a word in a story he knew how to read all too well, a story that ended in blood. He found them in a small, secluded clearing. Clara was slumped against the base of a large pine, her hands bound behind her, a dark bruise purpling on her cheek. She was conscious, her eyes wide with a defiant fear. The man she had shot was propped against a tree, his face pale, his shirt a sodden mass of red. The other two, the scarred man and his lackey, were arguing over what to do next. "We cannot take her back to Croft now," the lackey whined. "She shot Frank. We were just supposed to scare her." "Croft will not care how it gets done. You fool," the scarred man snarled. "He just wants the loose end tied. We finish it here. No one will ever find her." He drew his pistol. Clara flinched but did not scream. Her chin came up, a silent act of courage that twisted the cold knot in Eli's gut into a blade. He did not call out. He did not issue a warning. For years, he had lived by a solemn vow, a penance paid in silence and solitude. That vow was now dust. These men had touched what was his. They had hurt her. The ghost in the mountains was gone, and Black Carver had come back from the dead. He raised his rifle. The world narrowed to the space between the iron sight and the scarred man's back. He squeezed the trigger. The crack of the rifle shot was like a thunderclap in the clearing. The scarred man jerked, a look of profound surprise on his face, before he pitched forward into the dirt, a neat dark hole between his shoulder blades. The second man spun around, his pistol clearing its holster, his eyes wild with panic. Eli was already moving, sliding from his horse. The rifle dropped, the Colt seeming to leap into his hand from its holster. The years of disuse fell away. The muscle, the instinct, the cold calculus of violence. It was all still there, a terrible and familiar part of him. Two shots rang out in quick succession, so close they almost sounded like one. The lackey's shot went wide, kicking up dirt near Eli's feet. Eli's did not. The man grunted, a red flower blooming on his chest, and collapsed in a heap. Silence descended, thick and ringing. The only sounds were the panicked breathing of the wounded man and the soft whisper of the wind in the pines. Eli stood over the bodies, the smoke curling from the barrel of his Colt, his face a mask of cold fury. He had just broken the oath that had defined his life for nearly a decade. He had killed again, and he felt nothing but a grim, hollow satisfaction. Then, his eyes found Clara. She was staring at him, not at the dead men, but at him. Her expression was not one of fear of him, but of awe and a deep, gut-wrenching terror for him. He walked toward the last man, the one Clara had shot in the shoulder. The man was trying to crawl away, his face a mask of agony and fear. Eli kicked the man's gun out of his reach and stood over him. "Who sent you?" Eli's voice was a low growl, unrecognizable. "Croft," the man gasped, cradling his shattered shoulder. "Silas Croft. He wanted the widow silenced. Please, do not kill me." Eli stared down at the pathetic, whimpering man. The rage inside him screamed for one more death, one more pull of the trigger to erase this filth from the world. But then he looked at Clara again. He saw her face, her beautiful, bruised face, and he saw the fear in her eyes. Not for herself, for his soul. He holstered his pistol. "Get on your horse," he said, his voice cold. "Ride back to your master. You tell Silas Croft that Clara Rollins is under my protection. You tell him if he or any of his men ever come near her again, I will burn his entire ranch to the ground with him inside it. Now go." The man scrambled away, half crawling, half running to his horse, and fled without a backward glance. The adrenaline that had sustained Eli began to fade, and a searing, white-hot pain flared in his side. He looked down. A dark, wet stain was spreading across his buckskin shirt, just above his hip. In the chaos of the gunfight, the lackey's wild shot had not missed entirely. He had been hit. He stumbled, his vision swimming. He managed to cut the ropes on Clara's wrists before a wave of dizziness washed over him. He sank to his knees, pressing a hand to the wound, the world tilting precariously. "Eli!" Clara's voice was a sharp cry. She was beside him in an instant, her small hands hovering over his, her face pale with shock. "It is just a graze," he lied, his voice weak. He tried to stand, but his legs would not obey. The ground rushed up to meet him, and the last thing he saw before the darkness claimed him was Clara's face, her eyes wide with a fierce, terrifying determination. Clara had never known she possessed such strength. It was the strength of desperation, of a love so fierce it bordered on madness. Eli was a dead weight, his tall, powerful frame utterly limp. Getting him onto his own horse was a monumental struggle, a battle of leverage and will that left her gasping for breath, her muscles screaming in protest. But she did it. She tied him to the saddle to keep him from falling, and then, leading his horse and her own, she began the grueling journey back up the mountain. Every step was an agony of fear. She watched the dark stain on his side spread, watched the sweat bead on his pale brow. He was burning with fever, muttering names she did not recognize. Samuel, Maria, ghosts from the past he had tried so hard to bury. She talked to him, a constant stream of whispers and pleas. "Stay with me. Eli, do not you dare leave me. You are not a ghost. You are not allowed to become one. I will not let you." She pushed on through the afternoon and into the twilight, her body numb with exhaustion, her mind a singular point of focus, the cabin, the sanctuary. When they finally arrived, she half carried, half dragged him inside, lowering him onto his bedroll by the cold hearth. The next days were a blur of fever and fear. She became his nurse, his guardian, his anchor to the living world. She tore strips from her own petticoat to bandage the wound, a deep, ugly gash that had bled far too much. She boiled water and cleaned it relentlessly, fighting the infection that was raging through his body. She kept a fire going day and night, using the last of their wood, then breaking apart the remains of the table for more fuel. She coaxed broth and water between his parched lips. She sat by his side, bathing his face with cool cloths, her hand never far from his, as if her touch alone could tether him to life. In the depths of his fever-induced delirium, the walls he had so carefully constructed around his heart crumbled. He spoke of Kansas, of the dust and the blood. He cried out for the little girl with the corn-husk doll. He whispered his brother's name with an aching tenderness. Clara listened to it all, absorbing his pain, his guilt, his profound sacrifice. She was no longer just his lover. She was the keeper of his soul, the sole witness to the good man hidden beneath the killer's reputation. On the third night, The fever broke. He awoke to find her asleep in a chair she had pulled beside him, her head slumped forward, her face etched with exhaustion. The candlelight cast soft shadows on her bruised cheek. He watched her for a long time, a feeling so powerful and overwhelming rising in his chest that it almost choked him. He had spent years believing he was empty, a hollow man, but looking at her, he knew he was not. His heart was full of this woman, this fierce, stubborn, courageous woman who had dragged him back from the brink of death. She stirred, her eyes fluttering open. They were bloodshot and weary, but they lit up when she saw him looking at her. A slow, relieved smile touched her lips. "You are awake," she whispered, her voice hoarse. He tried to sit up, a sharp pain in his side making him gasp. She was there instantly, helping him, propping him up against the wall. She brought him a cup of water, and he drank it gratefully. They sat in silence for a moment, the intimacy between them a palpable, living thing. It was an intimacy forged not in passion, but in blood and vulnerability, in the shared knowledge of their deepest wounds. She reached out and gently touched the side of his face, her thumb stroking his rough beard. Her eyes filled with tears, not of sorrow, but of a profound, overwhelming relief. "You came for me," she whispered, the words a statement of wonder, a question, and a prayer all in one. He looked at her, and for the first time, he let her see all the way into his soul. He let her see the love he had tried so hard to deny, the fierce, protective devotion that had driven him to break his most sacred vow. The words came from a place deeper than thought, a place of pure, undeniable truth. "I always would." He healed slowly. Clara tended to him with a gentle patience, her presence a constant, reassuring warmth. As his body mended, so did his spirit. The bleak despair that had been his constant companion for years began to recede, replaced by a fragile, tentative hope. They talked for hours, filling the small cabin with their stories, their fears, their dreams. He told her about his brother, Samuel, and the life he had hoped he was living. She told him more about James, and the simple, happy life they had planned before Silas Croft's greed had destroyed it all. They were no longer two separate people hiding from the world. They were a unit, a partnership forged in fire and blood. When he was strong enough to ride, they knew a decision had to be made. They could not stay on the mountain forever. The trapper knew he was there. Croft's wounded man knew he was there. The world was closing in. The ghost could not remain hidden. "We could still run," Clara said one evening, though her voice lacked conviction. "We could go to Oregon." Eli took her hand, his thumb tracing patterns on her skin. "Running is what almost got you killed," he said, his voice firm. "I have been running for 10 years. It stops now. We go back together." "Together," she repeated, a fierce hope blooming in her chest. They rode into Sage Hollow 2 days later. They did not sneak in under the cover of darkness. They rode down the center of the main street in the bright light of midday, their heads held high. Eli's face was still pale and drawn, his arm in a sling, but he sat tall in the saddle. Clara rode beside him, her expression a mixture of fear and unshakable resolve. Their arrival caused an immediate stir. Doors opened. Faces appeared in windows. The whispers started instantly. The widow Rollins, returning from the wilderness with the strange mountain man. He looked like he had been in a gunfight. Goodwife Albright pulled her children inside, her face a mask of disapproval. But Mr. Gable, the mercantile owner, stepped onto his porch and gave Clara a slow, deliberate nod of respect. They dismounted in front of the sheriff's office and walked inside. The sheriff, a man named Miller with a drooping mustache and a weary expression, looked up from his paperwork, his eyes widening in surprise. Mrs. Rollins," he said. "We had thought, well, it is good to see you are safe." His eyes flickered to Eli, lingering on the Colt holstered at his hip. "And who is this?" "This is Eli Carver," Clara said, her voice clear and strong, ringing with a confidence she did not entirely feel. "And I am here to report a crime. I am here to report the murder of my husband, James Rollins, by men in the employ of Silas Croft." She laid it all out. She told him about the water rights, about James's plan to go to the territorial marshal. She described the men who had come to her homestead, the same men who had ambushed her on the trail. She spoke with a fiery conviction, her grief and anger transformed into a powerful demand for justice. Sheriff Miller listened, his expression growing more and more uncomfortable. He shifted in his chair, avoiding her gaze. "Now, Mrs. Rollins, those are very serious accusations. Silas Croft is a respected man in this community. You have no proof." "I am her proof," Eli said, his voice quiet but commanding. He stepped forward and unbuckled his gun belt, placing it on the sheriff's desk with a heavy thud. "I am wanted. There is a bounty on my head for $500. The name is Black Carver." The sheriff's jaw dropped. "The murders I am wanted for in Kansas were committed by men working for the same kind of people as Silas Croft," Eli continued, his voice steady. "Men who believe they are above the law. I took the blame to protect my brother. I have been silent for 10 years. I will be silent no longer. My name is Eli Carver, and I will testify, under oath, to everything I know about the corruption that runs these territories, starting right here in Sage Hollow. And she," he said, looking at Clara with a fierce pride, "will testify against the man who murdered her husband." The town was torn. Clara's public accusation and Eli's shocking surrender became the only topic of conversation. In the saloon, some men scoffed, calling Eli a liar and Clara a fallen woman who had taken up with a known outlaw. The preacher's wife crossed the street to avoid walking on the same boardwalk as Clara. The whispers followed them, a cloud of suspicion and judgment. But something else was happening. Others. The small ranchers and homesteaders who had been bullied and squeezed by Silas Croft for years began to look at Clara and Eli with a quiet admiration. They saw not a whore and a killer, but two people with nothing left to lose, standing up to a tyrant. They saw courage. The blacksmith, a burly man named Peterson, whose own well had run dry last summer, began telling folks that James Rollins had been right all along. A few farmers who had been forced to sell their land to Croft for a pittance gathered in the mercantile, speaking in low, angry tones. The simmering resentment that had been buried under years of fear was beginning to surface. The true test came the next day. The man Eli had wounded, his arm now in a sling, rode brazenly into town and stopped in front of the hotel where Clara was staying. He did not say a word. He just sat on his horse, staring at her window, his message clear and terrifying. Croft was not afraid. He was marking her. Clara went straight to the sheriff. "That man is one of the ones who attacked me. He is threatening me. You have to arrest him." Sheriff Miller wrung his hands, his face slick with sweat. "Now, Clara, he is just sitting there. He has not broken any law. My hands are tied. I cannot protect you from a man who is not doing anything. This is a matter for the circuit judge. When he comes through in the spring." His refusal, his cowardice, was the spark that lit the fuse. The news of the sheriff's inaction spread through the town like a wildfire. If the law would not protect a grieving widow from a known killer, then what good was the law? That evening, as Eli stood on the hotel porch, a silent guardian watching the street, the blacksmith walked by. He did not speak, but he met Eli's gaze and gave him a short, sharp nod. A few minutes later, two farmers appeared at the other end of the street, their rifles held casually in their hands, as if they were just out for a stroll. Mr. Gable from the mercantile came out onto his own porch and began cleaning a shotgun. The town was turning. The lines were being drawn. The decent folk of Sage Hollow were quietly choosing their side. A sense of justice, raw and potent, was beginning to simmer in the dusty streets, and everyone knew that a final, bloody reckoning was coming. The air in Sage Hollow grew thin and tight, stretched to the breaking point. Silas Croft's hired man remained a fixture in front of the saloon, a silent, smirking vulture, waiting for a death he was sure would come. The town held its breath. People moved with a quiet purpose, their eyes avoiding the threat in their midst but constantly aware of it. Doors were bolted earlier. Lamps were extinguished sooner. It was the heavy, oppressive silence that comes before a storm, a quiet that was louder than any noise. Eli and Clara felt it most of all. They were the eye of the hurricane, a small pocket of calm around which the entire town's fear and anger swirled. Eli did not leave her side. He was a silent shadow, his presence a constant, reassuring weight. His wounded side still ached, but his eyes were clear and sharp, missing nothing. He saw the way the blacksmith, Mr. Peterson, now kept a heavy hammer near the door of his forge. He saw how Mr. Gable stood on his porch for hours, methodically cleaning a shotgun that was already immaculate. He saw the farmers who came into town for supplies now lingered, their wagons parked in a loose, protective circle around the hotel. They were not an army. They were simple, decent men who had been pushed too far, and they had drawn an invisible line in the dust of their main street. The final confrontation came not with the swagger of a midday showdown, but under the cloak of a fading dusk. The sky was streaked with bruised purple and angry orange as 6 riders appeared at the edge of town. They were not ranchers or cowboys. They were hard men, their faces etched with the kind of cruelty that is bought and paid for, their coats unable to conceal the well-oiled pistols at their hips. They were a death squad, sent by a man too cowardly to do his own killing. They did not ride down the main street. They dismounted near the livery stable, intending to circle around and approach the hotel from behind, to finish their business in the shadows. But the shadows were not empty. A lamp in the blacksmith's forge suddenly flared to life, casting a long, stark rectangle of light across the alley. Mr. Peterson stood silhouetted in the doorway, a rifle in his hands. "This is as far as you go," he said, his voice a low, rumbling growl that carried in the still air. The hired guns hesitated for a split second, surprised by the unexpected resistance. That was all Eli needed. From the second-story window of the hotel, his rifle cracked, the sound sharp and final. One of the riders crumpled to the ground before he even had a chance to draw his weapon. Chaos erupted. Gunfire exploded from multiple directions, the peaceful evening shattered by the roar of pistols and the whine of ricocheting bullets. 2 more shots rang out from the mercantile's roof, where Mr. Gable and one of the farmers had taken position. Another of Croft's men fell, clutching his leg and screaming. Eli worked with a cold, detached precision. He was no longer the haunted man of the mountains. He was a tactician, a protector. Each movement was deliberate, each shot placed with deadly accuracy. He fired, levered a new round into the chamber, fired again, his face a mask of grim concentration. Clara was beside him, her fear a cold knot in her stomach, but her hands were steady. James's revolver was in her grip, but she knew it was useless at this distance. Instead, she took the second rifle Eli had procured, the one she had practiced with in the mountains, and began loading it as he fired. She would pass him a loaded weapon, take the empty one, and her fingers, though trembling, would work with a frantic efficiency, pushing cartridges into the loading gate. They were a team, a single unit fighting for their lives, for their future. Below, the street had become a battlefield. The hired guns, expecting to corner 2 people, found themselves in a crossfire. They took cover behind a water trough and a stack of barrels, firing wildly into the windows and doorways from which the shots were coming. A bullet splintered the window frame inches from Clara's head, showering her with glass. She did not flinch. She just continued to load. Her focus narrowed to the task, to the man beside her. One of the gunmen made a desperate run for the cover of the livery stable. From the hotel porch below, Clara saw a flash of movement. It was Mr. Gable's wife, a small, stern woman Clara had always been afraid of. Standing in the doorway with an old fowling piece, she fired, and the running man went down in a clumsy heap. The tide had turned. The remaining two gunmen, seeing their numbers dwindling and their ambush failed, knew they were beaten. One of them made a break for the horses. Eli drew a bead on him, but at that exact moment, the last gunman, the leader, rose from behind the water trough, his pistol leveled not at the rooftops, but at Clara in the window. Everything slowed down. Eli saw the man's intent, saw the black hole of the pistol's muzzle aiming for Clara. He did not have time to aim his own rifle. He moved without thinking, shoving Clara to the floor as a deafening roar filled the small room. A searing, brutal force slammed into his chest, stealing his breath and throwing him back against the wall. He slid to the floor, a look of stunned surprise on his face. He had been shot. Clara screamed his name, a raw, ragged sound of pure terror. As she scrambled to his side, another shot rang out from the blacksmith's forge. The gunman who had shot Eli collapsed, his pistol clattering on the dusty ground. The last of Croft's men, seeing his leader fall, managed to get to his horse and gallop off into the night, a messenger of failure. Then, silence. A profound, ringing silence descended on the street, broken only by the whimpering of the wounded man and the sudden, shocked sobbing of Mr. Gable's wife. The smell of gun smoke, acrid and heavy, hung in the air like a funeral shroud. The fight was over. They had won. But Clara's world had shrunk to the space of the hotel room floor, to the man lying crumpled against the wall, a dark, terrible stain spreading across his chest. She crawled to him, her hands shaking so violently she could barely function. "Eli," she choked out, her hands hovering over the wound, afraid to touch him, afraid of the damage that lay beneath. "Eli, look at me." His eyes, those pale blue eyes that held his entire soul, found hers. They were clouded with pain, his breathing shallow and ragged. A small, sad smile touched his lips. "You are safe," he whispered, his voice a faint rasp. "No!" she sobbed, tears streaming down her face, blurring his image. "No, you do not get to do this. You do not get to save me and then leave me. I will not allow it." She pressed her hands to the wound, trying to staunch the flow of blood, her touch desperate and futile. His life was pouring out from him, warm and slick against her fingers. He was fading, his eyelids fluttering. The strength that had sustained them, the rock she had clung to, was crumbling before her eyes. The terror of losing him, after everything they had endured, was a physical agony, a tearing in her own chest. She leaned close, her forehead pressing against his, her tears falling onto his face. The memory of that first night in the cabin, her own desperate plea for comfort in the face of a terrifying darkness, rose up from the depths of her memory. The words were a prayer, a command, a sob torn from the very core of her being. "Don't stop!" she cried, her voice breaking. "Don't stop breathing! Don't stop fighting! I need this! I need you!" He did not die. He was too stubborn, too strong. Or perhaps her desperate plea had reached him in the gray twilight between life and death and called him back. The town doctor, a man with gentle hands and whiskey on his breath, dug the bullet from his chest and declared that it had missed his heart by a miracle's inch. His survival was a testament to his own resilience and to Clara's unwavering care. She did not leave his bedside for a week, sleeping in a chair, her hand holding his. The town, now bound to them by shared battle and spilled blood, rallied around them. Goodwife Albright, her face etched with a newfound respect, brought broths and clean linens. Mr. Gable posted one of the farmers outside the hotel as a permanent guard. Silas Croft had been beaten, his power broken by the courage of ordinary people. He disappeared from the county 2 days after the gunfight, his ranch left to his creditors, his reign of fear over. Weeks later, when Eli was finally strong enough to walk on his own, his arm in a sling and his steps still slow, they returned to the mountains. The journey was not an escape this time, but a homecoming. The air was sweet with the scent of pine and new blossoms. The world felt clean, washed new. The cabin stood as they had left it, a silent testament to their harsh winter. The chimney was a pile of rubble, the doorway a gaping hole. But it was not a ruin to them, it was a foundation. Together, they rebuilt it. It was slow, hard work. Eli, with his one good arm, directed and advised, while Clara, her hands now calloused and strong, did much of the physical labor. She learned to mix mortar for the chimney, to set logs, to plane a piece of wood until it was smooth. They worked in a comfortable, easy silence, their movements a practiced dance of partnership. He would watch her, a look of profound love and admiration on his face, and she would catch his eye and smile, a genuine, happy smile that reached all the way to her soul. The cabin that rose from the damage was stronger than the one that had stood before. It was no longer a place of exile, a refuge for a ghost. It was a home, built with their own hands, cemented with their shared survival. The town did not forget them. As autumn began to paint the aspens gold, Mr. Gable rode up the mountain trail with a wagon full of supplies. A new stove, glass for the window, sacks of flour and sugar. It was a gift, he said, from the people of Sage Hollow, an apology and a welcome. They began to split their time, spending weeks at the cabin in the quiet solitude they both cherished, and weeks in town, rejoining the community that had claimed them as its own. The whispers about them did not vanish entirely, but they faded, losing their venom, becoming just another part of the town's history. Clara, with the help of the town council, turned the abandoned land office into a schoolhouse. She had a dozen students, the children of the ranchers and farmers who had fought beside them. She found a deep, abiding joy in teaching them to read and write, in nurturing the future of the small town she had once fled. She was no longer just the widow Rollins. She was the schoolteacher, a respected and vital part of Sage Hollow. Eli Carver, the man they once called Black Carver, found his own peace. He did not touch a gun again. Instead, he opened a small livery and began training horses. His quiet patience and intuitive understanding of the animals became legendary in the county. Men who had once feared his name now brought him their wildest colts, trusting him to gentle them. He was no longer hiding from his name, but redefining it, his skilled hands creating trust and partnership where they had once brought only violence. Their love, born in desperation and forged in conflict, settled into something deep and enduring. It was not a fiery, breathless passion, but a quiet, steady flame that warmed them against the cold. It was in the way he would bring her a wildflower he had found on the trail, or the way she would have a hot cup of coffee waiting for him at the end of a long day. It was a partnership built on a foundation of shared scars and absolute trust. One evening, years later, they sat in their rebuilt cabin outside. The first snow of the season was falling, thick, silent flakes blanketing the world in white. A fire roared in the rebuilt chimney, casting a warm, golden glow on the room. The rifles were gone from the walls, replaced by shelves of books and a few of Clara's pressed flower arrangements. The air smelled of wood smoke, baking bread, and peace. Eli sat in a comfortable chair he had built himself, and Clara sat on the floor, her back resting against his legs, her head on his knee. He stroked her hair, his touch gentle, his scarred hands a familiar comfort. The snow fell, muffling the world, creating a perfect, profound silence. They did not need to speak. The silence was no longer empty or haunted. It was full of everything they had overcome: the grief, the fear, the violence, the fight for their lives. It was full of the quiet joy of their schoolhouse, the gentle nicker of the horses in the corral, the warmth of the fire, and the steady, beating rhythm of their two hearts. Finally, truly, at home. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We would love to connect with you. So please comment with where you are listening from. Subscribe to our From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in English.